Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're here with none other than Diane Foley, the indefatigable mother of James Wright Foley, who has just published this year, January 4th, an amazing book. Anderson Cooper called it one of the books I've read in many years, if not my entire life. Michael Cunningham, who won a Pulitzer Prize for books such as The Hour, compared it to In Cold Blood. Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which was the renewal of new journalism and narrative nonfiction. And it really tells the story of Diane as an American mother. That's the title. I have it right here. So for us, Diane, it's such an honor for you to be here with us today, sharing your life's work for this past 10 years. I know this is the 10-year anniversary of the James Foley Foundation. And we're just so honored for what you've done for us, what you've shown us as Americans and citizens of the world about individuals and how we should fight for them and what an individual means and can mean for the world through your example and through your families and your sons and everyone who you united around you. You showed us the way, and I think you're still showing us the way. And I don't know how to thank you or express more gratitude than that. And I hope, as you say in your book, on page 125, you say, the inadequacies of the words you use will be transcended by the faith with which you use them. And you've showed us that, the faith with which we use our words. And hopefully my words in conveying that gratitude will express to you on the audience what it means. So one of the ways you've described your work is that more than 100 people, 100 people have been freed because of your work. And I just was wondering if you can start telling us, I mean, there's so many ways to start, but telling us, you said at some point you wanted to be in the Peace Corps, or you wanted to be in the religious order. And I think this service over self has both informed your family and yourself. And I don't know if you could start us there, or when you came to DC when you're 10 years old, for example, and then you came back all those years later. I don't know, this whole idea of service over self and what that means and how we get there.
Well, I'm very honored to be here, Pedro. I'm an ordinary American who wants us to be the best we can be. And it's our son, James Foley was the oldest of our 5 children, and he became a conflict journalist. And when he was killed by ISIS 10 years ago, this coming August, he has challenged me ever since, because Jim was a patriot, as am I. We believe in our country and our goodness and our values, and we cherish our freedom. And I just felt after Jim was murdered that our government could have done better. And so I've made it my life's work to do my piece and to help us. The reality is also, after Jim died, we lost 7 other Americans in that 2014, 2015 span of time. It was certainly not just James Foley. Stephen Sotloff, another brave freelance journalist, was similarly horrifically murdered, followed by Peter Kassig, a brave aid worker, Kayla Mueller, also an aid worker, Luke Summers, another journalist in 2015, and Warren Weinstein, a caring businessman who was killed in captivity. And somewhere in that time frame, Robert Levinson was also taken hostage and abandoned. So our government at that point in time had no one accountable for helping families like ourselves, who are not politicians or celebrities, to get attention to bring our loved ones home. Thankfully, we do have the backs of our brave servicemen, But for some reason, we kind of missed out on a lot of brave civilians who go out in the world as journalists, as aid workers, diplomats, educators, like the illustrious Senator McCain, who was out serving his country. It's so important that we remember and have the backs of our brave citizens, because our local community is small and we need one another in the world. So at the time when Jim was taken in 2012, there was no hostage enterprise bureaucracy in the US at all. So it was no one's job to help me. And rather than telling me that, I was sent in circles here in Washington for nearly 2 years. They really didn't know what to do with me, in all honesty. I'm sure I was annoying and kind of irritating. Like, what do we do with this lady? And made people feel uncomfortable. And it was that through that abandonment, really, of those Americans, they were all killed in that time frame. So I resolved that we could do better. So 3 weeks after Jim died, we started the James Foley Legacy Foundation, together with many of his dear friends. Jim had so many friends. He was a good friend to so many. And we all knew that Jim would have wanted some silver lining. And I, as a mother, wanted his life to mean something for others and to hopefully make a difference for others in the future. So we started the James Foley Legacy Foundation to advocate for freedom for all innocent Americans who are either taken hostage, like by criminal gangs or terrorist groups like Jim was, or by nation states, wrongful detainees like current journalist Evan Gershkovich, for example, or Alsu Kurmasheva. I struggle with those pronunciations, but very brave journalists today. But in the time our son was taken, there was no enterprise, no people helping. Now, 10 years later, we have a hostage enterprise that is engaged and has brought home, actually, I was told the current total since 2014 is 120 US nationals have been brought home into freedom. So I'm so grateful. And I really consider that not only Jim's legacy, but the legacy of all those Americans who died when we didn't know how to help one another in this way. However, just this morning, I was at a hearing at the Rayburn building at the Capitol, and somewhat dismayed, very dismayed, disheartened, if you will, to hear 8 families very bravely talk about the current hostage taking of their loved ones and how they've had trouble in spite of our hostage enterprise of getting their loved ones home. So our challenge continues. It truly does. And it is hard to prioritize the return of our citizens, because a lot of times captors want to make sure that for the return of a citizen that they interfere with our foreign policy. They want to hold the United States government hostage in return for our citizens. And that's the national security threat that this has become. That we as a nation need to be strong in our moral mandate to bring our people home, our innocent people who are out in the world, but also to work collectively with international allies and partners to deter the practice of hostage taking. So we still have a lot of work to do, but I'm grateful for the current hostage enterprise, and slowly but surely we're finding champions and good folks like the McCain Institute and other partners around the world. So grateful, Pedro.
No, Diane, the honor is ours, because I think you really showed us the way. And without you, none of this would have been possible. And maybe you can tell one story about Susan Rice or even President Obama and how this was before, because I don't think people understand if they don't read your book. Please read the book, available in all bookstores, but read it because to understand, and if you put yourself, if I put myself in your position or anyone else whose loved one is in this situation, going around knocking doors in Washington, D.C., and they don't open for 2 years, maybe you can tell a little bit of a story of how disheartening, so people can see the difference that it has made, and so people can also see what yet we have to do, because I think it's a sea change. And there's a beautiful poem you cite in the book, and maybe I'll read it later. But if you can tell us a little bit about how it felt and how it was, you have a beautiful image. I just can't stop talking about the book. But sorry, it's such a good book. Of you with your broken umbrella in front of the Capitol, and what you felt at that time.
Really hard because I just didn't feel like anybody cared. Nobody really wanted to talk to me. People were kind and would often take a meeting, but then they would send me back to someone else, and I literally was sent in circles. So things have changed. We at least now have people whose job it is to address this issue. We have really very diligent and amazing special envoy for hostage affairs at the US State Department, Roger Carstens. He's been brilliant. The one before him, Robert O'Brien, equally brilliant. This is a nonpartisan, bipartisan issue. This is an American issue. And it's an issue that we've had ever since the hostage enterprise was started. We've had great support on both sides of the aisle. And I think it's very important as a nation that we continue that this is a nonpartisan issue, just like having the backs of our brave soldiers. We must have the backs of our brave citizens who go out in the world to do good, to make a difference in the world, whether it's economically or through the news or education or whatever, that we bring our best people out into the world. We need to have their backs, should they be targeted, simply because they're American, not because they've done anything wrong. These are all the people we advocate for, are people who are serving the world, if you will. Our current hostage, Ryan Corbett, has been doing humanitarian work in Afghanistan for years. His family had lived there. And Taliban invited him back to check on one of his businesses in Afghanistan. They took him hostage. And now he's still being held by the Taliban. This is happening all over the world, primarily in China, Russia, Syria, Venezuela, and Iran. Those are the big ones, but I learned today about someone in Nigeria who was there and worked for our IRS for years and there helping with financial crimes and was arrested upon entering the country. So the challenge is really daunting because it's almost like people who our adversaries have found other ways to hold our government hostage. It's almost like a new Cold War, if you will. It's a new way of hurting our country where it hurts the most, with people, human beings, who are taken and held as political pawns to get some leverage over our own government. And I am so grateful to the congressman. It was the Foreign Affairs group in our US Congress who held the hearing today, because I think they learned a lot. I think their eyes were opened. It was so daunting to hear how these individuals are held around the world, taken, in many cases lured to the country. so that they could be targeted and taken hostage, and then to be used as leverage against our country. So the Foley Foundation does annual research every year. We interview the current hostage or detainee families to find out where they're finding obstacles, where they're getting support and hope, and where, in fact, there are many gaps. And we also interview many of the people in the hostage enterprise, government officials. How are they doing? What is working? What's not working? So that every year we provide recommendations so that we can help make our hostage enterprise the most effective possible in bringing our innocent Americans home, but also deterring the practice of hostage taking. So our research is key. We really feel evidence is important to inform our foreign policy. So that's a lot of what we've been doing. We're also working on safety education for aspiring journalists and any aspiring young American, any American who might travel abroad, that we cannot be naive. We need to recognize that a lot of people are jealous of our freedom. They're jealous of the many good things we have in this country, and they target us. And so we need to, when we choose to travel, we need to check on the safety of the country we're visiting. The government has a STEP program through the State Department to alert the embassy that you are traveling to a certain part of the world. I think all of these safeguards are incredibly important. And we need to enter countries respectfully with some, understanding and respect for the cultures and countries we're entering. Because we must do something to stop what's currently happening. And the Foley Foundation has begun the way, hoping the way I hope, but there's much work to do, so much.
Yeah, and I mean, because of the Foley Foundation's work, the presidential directive during Obama, then the hostage recovery cell, the SPIHA you mentioned, then the Robert Levinson Act, which we were also involved. The last NDA signed this year also included more funds, and I think it's part to those reports which are incredibly well researched. So thank you for building that infrastructure. In some ways, I wanted to call the audience attention to a part that sometimes it's not spoken about too much or discussed, which is the idea of paying ransoms or hostage swaps, because I feel that it is still a paradigm in which the Brits and the US, to be more precise, still operate. The idea being that, to not encourage more hostage taking, you're not going to pay ransom, even though you point out the hypocrisy that if you kidnapped or held hostage in your soil, the FBI will pay for your ransom, right? But they won't if you're kidnapped or held hostage abroad, which is so infuriating. But it seems it's shifting a little bit in some ways, but there's still that State Department or bureaucratic or foreign office in the UK saying, we don't do hostage swaps, we don't do ransoms, because in some ways it is true. It would incentivize more hostage taking. On the other hand, I've heard families of hostages said, please don't do it on the back of our hostages, right? You can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can bring our people home and you can deter at the same time. How do we start thinking about a different way of engaging with the world, and we're not stuck in this straitjacket of, oh, we can't do anything because it will incentivize? How have you seen?
Exactly. I think that's very well said, Pedro, because that was the problem. That was what President Obama was facing. He thought, oh, if we talk to them, they'll take more. And the reality is the evidence shows that if we don't talk to our adversaries, bad things happen. If you don't talk to a terrorist group that's holding, if you don't find some way, some channel to actually talk to people who are holding innocent people, those people will be killed. I mean, and that's the reality. That's what the evidence shows, that negotiation is essential. That whenever we close off channels to any of our adversaries, whenever we have no humanitarian way of speaking to them, that is a problem. That's what's happened with many of the people being held in Syria right now. We don't have diplomatic relationships. So those families, like, there's no way that our government can negotiate, can even get information out of Syria that confirms that those loved ones are still alive. So it becomes a real problem when we will not talk to people. Even though we may not want to talk to people we disagree with, Pedro, the peacemaker and humanitarian within us must recognize that if we want to protect our citizens, we must keep humanitarian channels open. It's a necessity. But at the same time, we need to have a parallel channel that's working on deterrence, that's working on deterring the next citizen from being targeted and taken hostage. And at times they are contradictory. There's no question about that. It is challenging. It is very challenging work. It requires our government to be more nimble and shrewd, just like captors are. The captors are plenty shrewd and nimble about who to target and when, but we don't often use all of our tools. One of our tools could be the use of ransom as a lure to work on that communication with the captor, offer the ransom so that we can, in fact, identify and arrest that captor. That's what has been done domestically. And I really think all tools need to be used, even the exchange of prisoners. We may not want to do some of that, but we're talking about human beings. We're talking about our citizens. So a lot of those need to be done in a strategic way. And that is why, particularly the deterrence side, requires us to work with our international partners, Western allies. Because if we're more consistent as allies in how we approach some of these nations like Iran, China, Russia, then hopefully together we can employ more leverage on them. Because even though sometimes we may not have leverage over some government, another country within our Western ally community may have leverage. And that's why I have been encouraged with how our government has addressed many of these Israeli hostages in Gaza, because our government has been willing to work with Lebanon and Qatar and Israel and find humanitarian channels to get through to Hamas. That is the only way. I mean, people will not come home unless we talk to one another and find shrewd ways of separating but continuing those humanitarian channels along with the deterrence. We need more tools every day. Someone was mentioning, I was at a talk the other day. I mean, we in the United States are very open in our society, but sometimes almost to a fault. Like sometimes we'll allow our universities and our borders to be open to oligarchs who allow their children to come in and go to school here, spend money here, enjoy the good things we have in our country, where back home they're holding someone hostage. Or we give humanitarian aid to a country who is holding one of our hostages. We see that a lot. So we do have leverage, but it needs to be a priority as a nation. We need to prioritize the return of our people and the deterrence of the use of people as political pawns for it to work. It's challenging, Pedro. But at least we have good people working on it. It's not just us. I mean, we're a part of it, but there are other NGOs like your institute, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. We have Hostage Aid Worldwide, Hostage US, which we help fund the start of. We have other NGOs all ideally working together, because it's a huge threat to our freedom.
Yeah, and that's the goal. And there was in this New York Times profile of you a while back, they talk about the Reagan-Carter hostage crisis, right? And how that was perhaps, according to the New York Times, the last time where a U.S. administration really fought to release hostages, and they were famously released when Reagan was inaugurated. And since then until now, on your work, is when it's become again a domestic political concern, right? We see it happening, and in some ways, from the outside, I've seen the Biden administration realizing that it's not a political there's not so much political backlash as they thought there would be, right? Because administrations, at least from the outside, are seen to be damned if they do, damned if they don't, right? If they do engage and they don't do it, if they don't do it, they're not doing it. So what they do, it's not political. And once it becomes a domestic political concern, they get involved. Can you talk a little bit about that part of the equation? Because it seems that there's amazing people who recognize it for the value of the individual, right? We have amazing people like Senator Shaheen and Coons and Durbin and Cardin, right? Who've been there since the beginning. Marco Rubio was there since the beginning. How do we make the case yet again? Why does it take such tragedy for people to react to this? Why is citizenship so difficult? In one sense, if citizenship means anything, it's for the government to protect you, right? And why do we have to wait until the Iran hostage crisis in Reagan's and Carter's? Why do we have to wait for the murder of James Foley to react? What will it take for us not to have to relearn every 40 years the lessons of not using people as hostages? There's right, and how the government should back it. Is there anything there that we can I mean, yeah.
You're right on. I think our work on how to resolve issues with the hostage taking or wrongful detention of our citizens has been reactionary. It has been. You know, sometimes we've reacted, sometimes we've said, no, we're not going to react. We're not going to engage, that kind of thing. I think the one thing we've learned is that our country has a moral obligation to try to help, particularly our citizens who are targeted simply because they're American, not because they did anything wrong. I mean, look at Evan Gershkovich is a perfect example of a journalist who was in country in Russia, had made all the precautions, went by the Russian rules of how to report from in country, knew the country, was respectful, living there, and then suddenly targeted and arrested. This is the kind of thing that happened to Jason Rezaian, who had been reporting from Iran for many years and lived there. We need to recognize that this is becoming an issue for Americans who work and live abroad. And therefore, we need to have a more comprehensive, preventative, strategic plan instead of such a reactionary plan. And in reality, a lot of us are beginning to realize this. I mean, even the Special Envoy's office has several who are working very hard on deterrence. We have several research institutes. CSIS here in Washington is working on looking at the issue. And we have third-party experts that are also coming on the scene. Governor Richardson's legacy is really this new global reach, who Mickey Bergman is running. And again, these are concerned citizens who are using their expertise to try to figure it out. We've got to do better. We've got to recognize that it is a Cold War, it is a war tactic, the way so many of these countries are deliberately targeting innocent citizens. And therefore, our country has an obligation to do all we can to bring them home, but but to strategically figure out how to disincentivize. How do we disincentivize nation states from doing this? How do we make it hurt? Maybe a lot of them are already heavily sanctioned, but maybe it would hurt if their children couldn't go to an American university. Or maybe it would hurt a terrorist group if they knew that, that we would try to arrest them. And but the big thing is that we must find ways to talk to people. I think it's as simple as that. And that's part of the reason I went to speak to Alexander Cody. He was one of the British jihadists who tortured and kidnapped our son Jim. Because I think somehow we must talk to even people we don't like. We've got to be willing to engage with people and listen to what they want and need, and then offer what we want and need. It's kind of a human need. The more we cut that off, the less successful we're going to be at helping our own people.
Very poignant part of the book is those meetings, and also the way you show how he got the best of the American justice system, right? And that it brought you hope that he, being a torturer and a convicted murderer, he got full fair trial, right? I think you mentioned $50 million was spent on his trial and the 32 witnesses. I mean, this is the other trial combined in both trials, right? He just pled guilty and then you spoke to him. But they both got the best, right, of that tradition of, hey, you did horrible things, but we're going to presume you're innocent until you're proven guilty. And you took that extra step of going to talk to him, right? And the book is, in a way, that search for telling the story so that your grandchildren will know what it was about, but also for all of us to understand what it means, right? You could have stopped at telling James' story, but you went one step further and you talked to the convicted murderer himself. And I don't want to give away the end of the book, but it's such a powerful moment, right, of what you choose to do in that way, right? To in some ways see evil and confront evil and hear from evil. Not that anyone is evil, but committed evil acts, right? And find understanding, and I don't know, justice or fairness or solace in there. But yeah, I don't want to give away the end of the book so people buy it. But it's so moving, it's so beautiful, and it speaks so much to our humanity, and what this work is about, right? It's about the human in all of us, and getting and doing that.
It is, Pedro. I mean, I guess if one thing people can take away from it is that I hope that Jim and the moral courage of many Americans we've lost can help us all to aspire to have the courage to use our gifts for good, to try to help goodness flourish in our society and our young people. There's plenty of hate in the world, but all that brings is suffering to everyone involved. So we must never tire of working for good, and in whatever way we can. And sometimes in the case of what happened to our son Jim, I had to insist that our government could do better. And that is what a lot of the families at the hearing right at the Rayburn this morning were doing. That even though, yes, some progress has been made, we have a law that has this hostage enterprise in place, but still a lot of people are suffering. And a lot of people, congressmen were kind of, many of them realized how little they understood about the issue. So I think it opened their eyes to And that is why we must talk to one another. We must, that's why our democracy, our congressmen and senators must hear the people, hear what is the experience of the people, if you will. And we people need to be willing to stand up when we think our government can do better. And our government can and will continue to do better. And that's what we aspire to do, is to just inspire all of us to do our part. If everyone does their part, things will continue to improve and we'll bring more and more people home, and hopefully we can deter the practice of hostage taking. But we must be willing to look at our adversaries as people also, not in a naive way, but as people who want things too, that they have needs, they have human needs like we do. And it's to our detriment to close those doors entirely.
Thank you. Yeah, and in closing, I wanted to read a couple things from your book, which when the trial judge cries during the hearing, and probably you say he's never cried, you say that our roles as parents is to make the unseen visible and to point to the importance of that which seems sometimes unremarkable, right? And it's this idea that you have done that for all of us, right? That could be unremarkable. You have made it visible for us. Later you say, try the world without him, see what happens. Try the world without people like James Foley or Diane Foley, for all these people, and see what happens. The world would be so much darker, and you really provide a light for us. And lastly, you say that one of James' favorite poems was this one about how hope and history rhyme. So I looked up the longer excerpt, and it's such a beautiful poem from a longer play, but it says, history says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, and this happened in your lifetime, and thanks to you, Diane, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracle and cures and healing wells. And I think you've done that for us. You've provided miracles and cures and healings, and we cannot thank you enough. So thank you so much, Diane.
I'm very humbled by that. It's just a beginning, Pedro. And I thank you, because we all must do our part and try. We must keep hoping. When hope is lost, we're lost. So I'm so grateful for you and your time.